Good morning. We'll call the study committee back to order. Thank you for being here again this morning. Before we get started, we'll ask Representative Chaz Cannon to open us up with a word of prayer.
Let's bow our heads. Dear Lord, thank you for allowing us to get together to discuss these important topics. Thank you for allowing us to travel here safely, to do your work, and to depart safely as we go back to our families. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, sir. Before we get started, just a tad bit of housekeeping. Today is Chairman Dickey's birthday.
Oh, happy birthday. Thank you very much.
Happy birthday, Mr. Chairman. Um, I know you look forward to getting home to have some peach ice cream with that cake you'll have later today. We heard a lot of great testimony yesterday from different aspects of the industry on the warehouse bonding, and one of the things that was discussed and hit at a high level yesterday was some model legislation that some other states have done. And so Jason Wamba is going to walk us through parts of that legislation this morning as we continue to have some ideas tossed about as to trying to determine which way we want to go when looking at some legislation. Jason.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate y'all having me here. Again, we've discussed the Wisconsin legislation on and off throughout this whole process. I think it's a good model to look at that we can build a good plan on because their their legislation does it's not a single entity or a single commodity indemnity fund, or they call it a security fund. Um, it covers grain, produce, and grain, veg, which would be our produce, and milk is what theirs is, but ours would be grain and produce. And there's a lot. I've had Anna email this to you, but we have kind of the beginnings of it on. We've always asked the question, what's the number? What do you have to have in the fund? Give me 1 second. I'm trying to pull it up. Uh, on page 2, it kind of outlines. I've got it too big. There we go. It's on page 2. It's 126.6 contingent financial backing. That kind of lays out their how their fund is set up, and it also covers some repayment in there for whenever it is filed upon. Um, yep, right there. It'll be on the back of the front page, right side, the bottom third. What we need to look at is what is that number? What would that number look like in Georgia? I believe our produce industry is exponentially bigger than Wisconsin's. Their number 17 million, that like I said, that covers three different commodities. Um, our produce industry alone would double what all their stuff does, I feel, without digging into their numbers of financial purchases, what their purchase numbers are, because they track it different than we do in the state. I mean, we would have to sit down and look at that part of it and look at the requirements for filing on this bond. What do you have to have? I mean, do you have to have a signed contract? Do you have to have, because right now in the state of Georgia, there's truly no rules that cover contracting in our warehousing rules. One of our grain failures right now is via text message. When we started filing on this bond, I had an email that had, I want to say, about 27 screenshots from his phone that has all the conversation about the grain purchasing. There's no sign, there's no piece of paper that says IX want to sell grain to Y grain warehouse with a signature, period. It's all via text message. So that's one thing that we would want to look at is what are the requirements to file on this bond or this indemnity fund after it is set up and move forward? What are your requirements? I mean, do you have to have a signed contract? Did you have to put into it? I know a lot of them, if you don't put in, I'm going to kind of use the term loosely, if you don't put into the fund, you don't pull out of the fund. So, and I know a lot of states will allow you to opt out, and by opting out, you can't partake in it. You can't, if you, something happens, we're not here to help you. I mean, they have to sign a paper saying we are opting out of participating in they call it an insurance fund, indemnity fund. And at that point, if somebody absconds with your stuff, we're not going to help you. So that's other things we need to look at with Wisconsin. I mean, I feel like this is a great base model of an indemnity fund because it covers three. Most of them in other states is a single fund. They have a fund for grain. They have a fund for cotton, which there's only 3 states in the United States that actually regulate cotton. Everybody else, it falls under the USDA. Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina are the only 3 states in the United States that regulate cotton as a state. Everybody, Texas, as much as they grow, they rely strictly on the feds. I think Texas grew I think they gin 2 point something million bales. I mean, there's no oversight on the state side. We're one of the only ones. So, I mean, we have to look at what is the numbers, what commodities are we going to pull under it, and how do we fund it? We actually need to really start with how do you what's going to qualify as a claim. That's where it kind of builds on what do you have to file on this? Again, goes back to there's no, like in your world, is there a signed contract?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, it really is always bumfuzzled me that we don't have anything on grain. I brought it up in the past, but it's never, whenever I was with the department, it was brought up and we were going to look at it later, and I guess we're at later, but, we're going to look at it later. I mean, you can kind of look through this. You see, it lines out the whole thing. I'm really good at hitting the high points on these. When it goes into getting into the weeds of it, that's something that I think that it's going to truly take going over all 37 pages that everybody has. And I don't think we have time to go line by line on 37 pages of legislation today. But there, with this legislation, I feel like it's the best building block for Georgia, the way that it's built. I hope that made sense to you.
Excuse me. Thank you, Jason. Commissioner, one of the things that's been mentioned from several different times is the auditing aspect of what the department does for some of these firms. How many auditors do you have, and is that an area that we need to look at to provide additional funding for the department to get around more frequently, or whatever that time schedule is for the auditing part of it?
So right now we currently have 3 auditors. I believe we'll have 4 starting in January. Jason can probably speak more to the details of how often they can get around to all the facilities. But I mean, to that point, Mr. Chairman, I will never turn down additional staff. We're always in the need of additional help. As we've had that conversation just in general about the agency overall, which we whittled a lot of that down in a lot of the vacancies that we have. the auditor positions were an example of that, where we did have some vacancies, and we've been working to fill those. Um, so I'll punch it to Jason to speak to specifically, uh, you know, how many, how many, how much those auditors can get done, those four, and how many more we may or may not need to help us get around to ensure that we're doing as much of that auditing as possible.
Right now in the state, we have 3 auditors. We have 3 field auditors, 1 manager, and a assistant in Macon that kind of handles the filing and the phones and mail and everything else. Our 3 auditors for our on the grain side, they're in every grain warehouse in the state of Georgia every 2 months. We go measure and reconcile their books every 2 months. On the produce side, we kind of annually check. We do what's called a self-check. We try to get out in our quote unquote off time or downtime and go visit the packing houses and the pecan buyers and everything else. We have to go around if they're buying pecans, so we have to get them to sign a cash statement that they're paying for cash for their pecans, because if not, they have to have a bond, like we've stated in the past. If you're paying with certified funds, you don't have to have a bond. But on the cotton side, we do it twice a year. We do it once at the end of ginning season. We'll go in and count the entire house. It's just a really quick run through, make sure that their numbers match and there's no issues. In the fall, when they're in their lowest, right before they start ginning again, we'll go in and do a 100% tag check. We go in and check every bale. They get what's called red bales and missed ships and everything else, and we help reconcile their books that way. But with the grain, every 2 months, with the cotton, twice a year, and with the produce, as needed. And that's the easiest way to put that. If we get a call that, not picking on you, but Mr. Dickey's getting out of line, then we'll go over and sit down and talk to him and see what's going on and kind of look at everything and see what he's buying and who he's buying from. And with the cattle on the livestock side, every 2 months they're in there as well. So I have 3 auditors that cover, oh Lord, a lot. Like I've always told them that you never have nothing to do. You're never caught up, because there's always, if you just did a grain warehouse, go do it again, because we ran into somebody was stealing grain in central Georgia. We had just done a grain audit 2 weeks prior, and this was my predecessor. I have no idea why he did it. He just said, let's just run back over here to this place. I want to go check them again. And there was 10,000 bushels missing. And the owner was like, what in the world? And so the police got involved, and they kind of figured out what happened, and they had more securities put in at that warehouse with cameras and everything else. But if we hadn't decided that day to just go back and check again, he wouldn't have known for 2 months that grain was gone. And we don't know how much further that would have went to, how much more they would have taken. So, I mean, if that answers your question as to how often we're in and what we do as auditors. On the grain, we're checking a lot of receipts, for the collateral receipts that they use for financial backing for operating loans, stuff like that. We check those versus their inventory. We make sure that you're within 3% on your inventory. If you say you've got 10,000 bushels, we make sure you're pretty dang close. And it depends on the time of year, what harvest we're in, as to how close you're going to be, because corn shrinks, beans grow, and wheat stays the same. So you'll always end up with more beans than you put in the bin. It's just the fact of life. Corn is going to shrink, just it's going to happen. And wheat, about the same amount you put in there is what you're going to take out. So we make sure that those numbers stay in line. And if we see any issues with the grade, we don't grade, But whenever we go up there, if it has a smell to it, if it has black crust on top or anything, we'll kind of advise them, hey, you might want to turn the fans on. We kind of help in that aspect of it.
So how many, excuse me, of those three auditors, how many accounts, I'll say, or between produce, cotton, livestock, how many different sites will they visit? Do we know that number total?
We don't actually go visit all of these dealer and ag products because they're scattered out all over the US and Canada. But we have 151 dealer and ag products that we manage, we'll call it. I have 64 grain dealers that are all over the US as well. We have 20 grain warehouses, and I believe we have 21 cotton warehouses that 3 auditors and a manager handle on a daily basis. And to give you some background, before I started here, there used to be 7, and the only thing that we did was grain and cotton. We had 7 auditors, and the only thing we did was grain and cotton.
So you've talked a lot about the auditing the inventory and their of what's on site. Do you also look at financials when you do that?
They send us a financial statement once a year. That's in our rules that they have to send in a reviewed, not an audited, but a reviewed financial statement.
Annually?
Yes, yes, sir. Goes with their license. It's a reviewed, not an audited. Correct.
Will you use
Correct.
your mic there?
They'll, for lack of a better term, the CPA will look over it, but they won't like stamp this has been audited financial statement. Say one more time. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Any questions from members of the committee? Mr. Campbell?
In grain, how do y'all handle shrink? Is there a formula?
We use a 3% shrink. It also will take into account what the test weight is. What's the temperature been? I mean, if we're running a really hot summer and you've got corn in the bin and you haven't taken care of it, I'm not trying to point fingers at anybody, but I'm just saying what's been out there. If you haven't taken care of it, we've got to pull a sample and do a test weight on it. And we'll kind of manage that way. But our rule of thumb is 3%. That's the USDA standard on corn is 3%. You really don't get shrink on beans, and you don't get shrink outside of weevils, so that's why they have to spray them and take care of everything. That answer your question, sir?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Any other questions? Right, Mr. Chairman?
Thank you. You bring up a lot of questions. My mind's sitting here just beyond.
I
I
actually had this conversation with him. I said, this conversation can become a spaghetti junction
Yeah.
of other conversations. So I want to make sure that we can have every conversation you want. I'm here until you tell me to leave, but I'm trying to hold it. But whatever you got, I got you, boss.
No, I mean, it's great. I mean, I never, before this meeting or before we started this committee, knew what all, we did and it's, so it's very complicated, very comprehensive. I mean,
I always say
I'm
we're
sitting
the
here trying
biggest,
to figure out
smallest
what's
division
the
there
best
is.
Solution. I mean, it's different pathways. You could do more auditing, you could do more,
Well, whenever you get
bonds
into
or-
a deeper audit than what we do, because again, we're doing collateral verification. We're here to protect the bank and the everywhere else on the collateral side. Like you have your grain receipts.
The real question though,
Yes, sir.
would more auditors prevent a problem? I mean, how much, how
Honestly-
deep can you do to prevent a problem? If somebody's having financial problems,
Yes, sir.
they're probably trying to hide it or trying to delay it. And
That's why we're in as much as we are. The USDA only goes in every 18 to 24 months to do an audit. And we're the only state in the United States that's in a grain warehouse as much as we are.
yeah,
Every other one is about once a year, and we're in there 6 times a year. But do we need more help? Absolutely. Because I don't want to say we rush, but we have X amount
Yeah.
to get done. And if we could get more auditors, absolutely, we could slow down and dive deeper into the law. That would allow us to look at what's their head's position. But we also have to be careful because we're not CPAs.
Yeah.
We are grain auditors. We don't have that title behind us. And so that's going to dictate how deep we can go as an auditor. Can I train anybody to look at their position report and see what they have on delayed price and price later contract or anything? And I see they have 1 million bushels on DP or PLC and they have 10,000 bushels in the bin. That's kind of an issue that we would want to look at.
I think to that, to get, not to step away from the grain conversation, but to kind of step into the produce side a little bit. And Jason can speak to this better than I can, but what we have run into more than once on the produce side is even though we have folks that are quote unquote on paper legitimate, they have two sets of files, right?
Mhm.
So they have one set of files that they show us, and they have another set of files that are the real files, right? Where they're doing their fly by night activity and they're covering themselves. So to your point, if we had, if we had possibly more time, if we had more resources, could we try to dig into some of those operations where we think they may have two sets of files and try to figure that out? It's very possible, but if we're limited by the amount of time that we have, we're going to review the files that they lay in front of us. And if those files are legitimate, then we move on and we strike that up as legitimate. But there has been cases where, and Jason can speak to that better than I can, but where we have run into and we know that they carry multiple files on purpose because they're covering up that either that percentage or whatever the case may be. And so that does become an issue. The other issue obviously is we're only auditing the people that have a license.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
if they're not licensed by the department, we're not auditing them. Or in some cases, we don't even know about them. So, I think that becomes a thing for us is I don't really have any extra staff or team to go out and hunt down those folks that are completely violating the law because they're operating in our state without a license and without a bond under the current law. And they're buying product and selling product in doing that. And so, we find that from time to time with the staff that we have? Yes. But that's another one of those areas where we could really focus on as an agency is looking for those folks that aren't licensed, that aren't bonded, that are, for all practical purposes, do cause some of the issues that we've run into but when in fact, though, the two issues we're dealing with right now are both licensed entities. But so it's not always the unlicensed entities that are the problem. So I think to your point, Mr. Chairman, with obviously with additional resources, you can always do a lot more, right? So I think there is opportunity for that. And where we can go look for those folks that aren't abiding by the law as it currently stands, number one. And then number two, really dive deeper into those folks that we kind of have a little question about, in a way that we can spend more time on those specific entities.
Thank you, Commissioner. Chair Lady Camp.
Thank you so much. All right, so I kind of had the experience that Chairman Dickey had where my ears started tingling and I thought, oh my goodness, there's so many avenues to go down with this. All right, so the first, I guess I have a question about the contract situation where you had screenshots of text messages that went back and forth. I mean, I'm not an attorney, I'm not pretending to be, but I mean, how is that enforceable if it comes down to a court situation?
Technically, I mean, you can do a handshake contract and they're still viable contracts. It's verbal.
Yeah, but the
But
enforceability of it, I mean,
I-
you can have a verbal contract with anyone, but
I'm doing a bond claim on it right now. That's all I'm telling you. It's going through in every aspect that I've seen before I left. Everything was pushing through. Was I a fan of it? No, ma'am, not at all. I started asking for contracts and everything, and then that's when I started getting the text messages and made me kind of tingle as well, because it's a he said, she said conversation, and those never end well in the grain industry and the ag industry.
Well, I guess because I was just thinking there's so many opportunities. You can e-sign, there's so many digital contracts you could do. You can sign on your phone, which is sometimes easier than actually doing text back and forth. Is that something that we might be able to incorporate in looking at legislation? Because it's going to be almost impossible for the commissioner or the Department of Agriculture or any agency to run down and say, well, please send me all your text messages.
With that, ma'am, normally whenever I start an investigation, I say the exact same thing. And I actually have it wrote down verbatim for Chad. I said, I need every piece of information on this that you have. I don't care if it's a sticky note. I don't care if it's a whiteboard. I don't care if it's a text message. I need every email, every text message, everything so that we can gather all the evidence. To your talking about signing on your phone, there are companies out there that do provide online grain contracting and other contracting capabilities that are signable from anywhere. So that is something that could be looked at, but that would take another piece of legislation or another set of rules to go that route.
And then lastly, Commissioner Harper mentioned yesterday 2-19-1 in OCGA. And I was looking over it yesterday and then again this morning. It looks like it's very specific to the instances that happened in the late 90s. Have we heard anything from Legislative Council, their opinion, if that legislation could be modified for kind of what we're talking about here, or would we require an entirely new piece of legislation? For OCGA code.
So what's in code in that is specific to what happened in the 90s. Chairman Meeks and I'm sure Chairman Dickey and others could probably talk more in detail about that offline or at a different time. That was a whole debacle, to say the least. But it was specific to that one incident. That said, though, it did create, though, a foundation for an indemnity fund in the code. And all I was suggesting is that we could work with Legislative Council to modify the way that it is currently in the code and use that same provision as a kind of a starting point. So
A template type thing.
kind of, yeah,
Okay.
it's because there's a lot of things that would need to be changed in the way it's currently set right now, right? Because it specifically talks to cotton and cotton only. It specifically talks to cotton produced between this time frame and that time frame. A lot of that kind of stuff would have to be modified or taken out completely. But at least it's a starting point that we know the state has passed that before. It did go into state law. It is a indemnity fund that was used specifically for that purpose. There's specific language in there regarding who can apply, which it would be different in this case, but at least gives some initial, I guess, framework to look at as you start to build out what that looks like moving forward. And specific instructions to the commissioner, specific instructions to the department. It gives specific instructions to the General Assembly on what, on how things. So anyway, I think it's a starting place to work with Legislative Council to work to modify it. I think you could modify it and work through that to get it to where to something that would be a lot more workable for multiple commodities for a longer period of time.
Okay, and I promise I'm almost done. But and this is for you or for Jason, do you think it might be advantageous, just thinking, to leave that provision in place as is, create new, funds of this type and not put it all under one umbrella, but have grain, have fruits and vegetables, actually have it separated out? Or do you think it'd be better to do it collectively?
I mean, I'll let Jason give his opinion. I think for me, collectively would work just fine. I mean, we have other states that have done that, which is partly the reason we've looked at Wisconsin, because they have a collective program that oversees three different commodities. Um, I think a collective program would work fine for us. Um, I think the specific to that provision in the code, it was for a one-time event. That event has now transpired. So modifying that particular section of code is not going to impact anything that I'm aware of off the top of my head. Obviously, we'll verify that, but I'm not aware of anything that modifying that current code section would impact anything that we do at the department. And it basically would give us the ability to take something that is already in the code that was used for a specific event and modify it to be useful for all ag producers that are in those particular arenas and help them move it forward.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Representative Leverett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It seems to me to touch on some of the comments that have been made to Chairman Dickey's question about, if you do more audits, do you sort of, what I sensed the chairman asking was, do you, if you do more rigorous and more frequent audits, do you then need to have the fund? I think what I heard y'all say as well, you probably would catch more, but you don't necessarily catch it all because you've got just some bad actors out there who are trying to conceal from you the fact that they might be having a bad year or a bad spell. And they, I think the way a lot of these things happen is they think, well, I'm going to get through it. I just don't want to have to deal with all this other stuff that's going to pull me down harder if I start getting scrutinized and have to do these extra things. So I'm just not going to share everything right now. And I'm going to get back on the other side of this and I'll be fine. And then things keep getting worse. So it would seem to me you still need to consider having some kind of fund or protection, if that's the thing the committee decides to recommend. But I think that one statute or series of statutes to me raises so many policy questions within that context. What do you have? One fund that everybody pays into and everybody can draw out of it? There's a claim. Do you have different procedures based on prevailing practice in different commodities or different industries? Do you have a uniform? And then this whole thing about written contracts. I mean, that to me is a real tough question, not knowing that much about the markets. The testimony I've heard, it suggests to me that it is not really feasible to do written contracts in a lot of these businesses. It's very difficult to do, or nobody does it. And my assumption is because it is viewed as difficult. I mean, you've got a million things to worry about growing something, then also to have to pull out a form contract and fill it out or go to a lawyer. I mean, God forbid that. I think that would make it expensive. So that's an issue. But do we want to require that in order, if you're going to make a claim on this fund, do we need a written I mean, I think that's a valid policy issue. So it is that one potential recommendation the committee may make alone is itself going to prompt another study committee. I think.
If I may, real quick, I'm going to touch on three things, and it's going to go to you and you and you. One, the contracting, we're one of the only states that has no regulation on contracting. Other departments of agriculture, whenever they go in, they actually go pull contracts, and it doesn't have to go through a lawyer. It's a legal contract that's between the grain warehouse, cotton warehouse. I mean, right now, Staple Cotton does it. We do it in the cotton industry. You do it in the peanuts. Grain is one of the only ones that we don't actually oversee the contracting of. With the triple fund, I feel I like a single indemnity fund for every one of them better than a triple. I love their model. And I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. If Mr. Dickey has produce and you grow grain and you grow cotton and Mr. Dickey goes out of business and you two have put into the fund, but his claim exhausts the fund, now you two have to put back into the fund because of something that he did. So I do believe that would be a one drawback from producers or from the industry that would stop that. That, like, I would say a fund for grain, cotton, and produce in a whole would do better. Now, could it be ran under one umbrella? of an indemnity fund, like you have the indemnity fund umbrella, and then you have a grain, a cotton, and a produce, yes. I feel that would be more advantageous for the state as a whole. And for the lack of a better term, you'd probably be able to sell it a little better because again, it could come down to if Mr. Dickey goes out, because that's our biggest one, is the produce industry where there's the most bad players. If we exhaust it for the grain and cotton, and then the next week I have a grain, I have a grain failure, and there's no money there. So we would have to look at the cap, how that goes back to my initial thing as to who can file, how do you file, but where's your cap? At what point does everything kick back in and shut back off? I hope that kind of answered everything, and I didn't mean to step on your toes on that, but.
I think, to your point, Chairman Leverett, really quick, and I know Representative Meeks can speak to this just like I can. I sign a contract for cotton and peanuts every year. And I'll be honest with you, I probably wouldn't grow cotton and peanuts if I didn't sign a contract. Now, some of it could be a price later type contract to where, but it's still a contract. I have a contractual agreement between myself.
Written.
It is written.
Yeah.
And the buyer. Now, I do sign it via email sometimes, right?
That's fine.
Or I sign it in person. It depends on where I'm at. If I'm in Atlanta, I sign it via email. If I'm home, I'll run by the peanut mill or the cotton gin and sign the contract. But it's either so not every grower signs contracts for some commodities, right? But for the most part, the majority of producers in the peanut and cotton world sign a contract of some sort. So it has been shown to be feasible in other commodities, I guess is what I was trying to use that as an example. And I know Chairman Dickey said earlier that he signs contracts with his peaches.
Once a year
Yep.
blanket.
That's right. So there may or may not be a price agreement per se in those contracts, but there at least is a written contract between you and the buying entity. And then at some point, as the contract stipulates, if there's no price agreement, you would make that agreement at some point during the term, right? And that agreement then would be spelled out and how it's done in the contract and all that kind of good stuff. So you may not be signing a contract for a specific fixed price, but you at least have a contractual agreement with the person that's buying your product with agreed upon price between the producer and the buyer later.
Well, and to me, that's the crucial thing. I mean, because my assumption would be that if you've got a written contract that you're discussing that doesn't have a fixed price, at some point, there is a text or an email that can be used as evidence of what the subsequent agreement as to the specific price was.
Right.
And that would certainly make your job easier. And I would imagine that in most kinds of bond context and indemnity fund, I would assume there is a requirement of some kind of written contract, because otherwise you don't really know what
That's right.
what the claim is, if it's bona fide or not. So, but anyway, that's it. That's very good to know, and I appreciate that that input. But I think we, there's still a lot of ciphering to be done on how we structure this. And one other question, Mr. Chairman, Jason, were you saying that you feel that the fund should be set up? I wasn't sure if you were saying you feel like there should be just one fund into which everybody pays and which everybody would make claims against across all commodities.
I feel we could do a umbrella that is broke out into three to where you have, for the lack of a better term, you have one big bank account, but you have separate sub accounts for produce, grain,
different
and cotton.
commodities.
Because again, if you had a major produce failure, it could literally wipe out a $17 million fund. And if we had a grain failure a month later, there's no money there. So we have to be very careful as to how we word it. As for that reason, now granted, we haven't had many grain failures, but we've had several produce. So that's our biggest ask, is that right there is where our produce is. So that's the fund that I would almost say the produce fund would need to be bigger than the grain and cotton fund. What's that number? I don't know, but I do believe that the produce fund would have to be bigger than the grain and cotton on that side. But I hope that answers.
I think it does. So when you say umbrella, you mean there would be sort of a common fund, but it would be segmented into separate accounts that would cover liabilities only from certain
Correct.
sectors.
Correct.
And I'm assuming then they would be funded only by things collected from that
Correct.
sector.
There's several ways it could be funded. It could be a producer funded account, or a producer funded fund where it's an assessment kind of, you already do a produce, for the produce, commission. I mean, you pay an assessment there. It could be another assessment on per box, per bushel, per whatever. On cotton, it would be per pound. I mean, you could do it just another small assessment, but that assessment would shut off whenever the fund exceeds a certain amount. And then if it's ever depleted below an amount, it would kick back in.
And how is that currently collect? I mean, does when the producer is paid, does the producer then owe the money back, or does?
There's several ways it could go. Most of the time, it would come from the warehouses or the brokers or the buyers or the packers.
It's almost like remission of the sales tax. They just
Correct. Like right now, we have the commodity commissions, and we have auditors that go around and check their books and say, you owe X for the commodity commission. We have, I believe there's 2, maybe 3 now that go around to all of your produce, your cotton, your grain. They go around and check that for the commodity commission. It could be another check right there. Is that okay for the insurance fund, whatever nomenclature you want to put on it, whatever you want to call it, you owe X for this on your grain side, you owe X for this on your cotton side, you owe X for this on your produce side. Now, again, whenever the fund reaches a certain cap, that assessment would shut off. And it could be where we go another 20 years with no claims. And I hope that's what we do. I hope we never have to touch a penny of it and it sits there and draws interest. But in the real world, it's going to happen. And then when it depletes down, it would kick back in at a certain point.
So do you have to go by and audit and collect, or are you auditing just to make sure they've been remitting what they're supposed to?
Auditing to ensure that they're remitting.
Okay.
With the commodity commissions, sometimes there's certain entities that you're going to have to go and poke.
Oh, yeah.
And you're gonna go in there.
Chairman Dickey again causing trouble.
I'm not pointing any fingers, and I'm not trying to poke the bear, but there's certain entities that you do have to go and you do the audit, and then you look at them and go, here's the envelope with the Atlanta address. Please write the check, put it in this envelope, and let me see you put it in your outbox.
Yep.
And then it goes to Atlanta to get processed and gets put in those commissions funds. So it would just be another check like that.
Yep. And unfortunately, we do have to do that from time to time, even with, we run into it with out-of-state buyers who are buying Georgia product. Well, the way the law reads under the Commodity Commissions Act, it doesn't matter if you're in Florida or Oregon. If you buy a Georgia product as a buyer, you are responsible for remitting it back to the commission. And so we have to remind those out-of-state purchasers from time to time that they are responsible for the remission. So that does happen. So we have experience in that, unfortunately. But that's kind of how that process worked. Woody laid it out pretty well. And I would think it would work. I would suggest that it would work similar in this particular case as well.
With the dealer and ag products, I just kind of roughly glanced at our licensing program. We have roughly 16 states that buy out of the state of Georgia. And that's 16 states and Canada are licensed. So that would mean that we would have to do our fertilizer people actually go out of state to do fertilizer tonnages. Mm-hmm. So it could be that we have one set of auditors that go around and they go to these states, and I'm not saying we got to send them to Canada, but I know Sobe's the one that buys out of Canada. And I mean, we have a good relationship with them. I've kind of helped build that previously, and they're very easy to work with. If I tell them, hey, we're doing this. This is what's happening. We're going to send you the forms and the documentation on it. Start remitting this as of X. And they're very good about it, but we would have to start going to further states. Because again, just with a quick look, counting down the line, it's roughly 16 states by the state of Georgia. And that's from New York to California, no, excuse me, Maine to California, Florida to Wisconsin. So, I mean, you're literally covering the entire United States.
Representative Cannon.
Mr. Chairman, I like the idea of skin in the game is, attractive to me. Kind of like we have a sick bank policy at our work where you have to be a part of the sick bank in order to take from it if you want to apply for it. But it seems like if the folks that are not licensed or bonded might come out of the woodwork and say, I want to be eligible for this indemnity fund. And so therefore I'm going to get licensed and bonded, and to make them kind of like a carrot approach. If there's funds available for them and they need it at a certain point, then they'd have to be part of the indemnity fund and there before be licensed and bonded.
Correct. The only thing I want to make sure we make clear that the indemnity fund is for producers. It wouldn't be for the brokers. And I've slightly touched on that conversation yesterday, where I have had that conversation with brokers and buyers going, well, what happens whenever I have to carry this bond? What happens whenever I can't get paid on my side? And that we turn into to lawyers and go, I would go that route. I mean, do I think that it could go that way later? I think we would be diving into some deep weeds right there whenever you talk about people coming out of the woodwork. I would say we want to make sure that it's strictly producer, because not to be ugly, that's what I'm here for, is the producers. I want to make sure that the bad players are not hurting the Georgia producers, because in the end, that's what we're here for.
Second. Just another question on the producing side. If you're a producer and you get audited, I know it's just part of the process, but it's not fun. No one really, it's just, you got to do it. It does require some additional labor and time and effort. What did you think the impacts would be from more auditors or more auditing going on? Is that something the producer's going to say, great, no problem, or will they kind of push back a little bit against it?
We wouldn't audit the producers itself. That the producer would never get audited. We would look at the sales from all of your dealer and ag products. I'm going to pick on him because he's sitting right here in front of me. We would go to his office and say, okay, we're here to do your annual audit to see who you're buying from. And those producers would have put into this fund to be able to recoup from that fund. So we would never audit a producer itself. It's only the dealer and ag products.
Gotcha.
Any other questions? Chairman Dickey.
I got a question and basic, I heard the comment that Georgia is one of 3 states that audit cotton and get involved with that. So what value are we giving that Texas isn't? I mean, is that something we need to continue? The cotton program, has it been good value and protection? I just asked a basic question.
I've got a really good answer for it. I'm going to give you an example. In 2010, for the lack of a better term, I got access to EWR, which is the Electronic Warehouse Receipt Program that the state uses. It's the same program that's used all over the United States. I found 310 bales that had never been sold from a Georgia producer, and the man had passed away. He got killed in Brooklet, and there was 310 bales that had been sitting there since 2004. This was in 2010, whenever cotton hit $1. Now, we took a week and dove into it and figured out what happened, and there was some not missing paperwork, but there was paperwork not getting done correctly, and Farmer A's cotton was getting sold as Farmer B's. It was the person running the computer wasn't doing a good job, and they were no longer there. But those bales had slipped through the cracks, and if it wasn't for our auditing, those bales would have still been sitting there in 2024. So we were annually, and offline, I can show you what I'm talking about. I can look at EWR and tell if a bale has been sold. So we annually, in our fall audit, go through that list and look Just because the bale's sitting there, that doesn't mean that it's been sold. You'll find ones and twos that was a small module or something that never got sold. So we go in and I give a comprehensive list to the warehouse. These bales right here have never been sold. And it's always a great argument because they say, of course they have. And I go, of course they haven't, because the documentation says that it hasn't. So we help producers in that aspect in our auditing by finding the ones that, and like I said, that was an oddity that there was that many bales, but we had never looked at it that way. It's always good for us to look at it in that aspect where I can go back and look and say, this bale right here for Mr. Dickey and everybody else has never been sold. So we make sure that all the bales are accounted for. We make sure all the bales have been sold and go that route once a year. Now, it's very tedious whenever it comes into that. And again, I'd be happy to show you that process offline right here. I can show it to you right here how we do it. But it's a very good value for our producers because
That's what I want to hear.
one of the son was actually on the board of the gin that it had been stored in the whole time. Like he had walked by those bales 1,000 times and never knew they were his dad's bales that had passed away. And it was really funny because we went back and looked and it was like 60-cent cotton in 04 and he got 98 cents for them in 2010. So, I mean, it was a great value and it was a Merry Christmas because it was in December. So, I mean, it was one of those deals that I said, hey, Merry Christmas from the
Great
Georgia
story.
Department of Agriculture. Here's 310 bales you didn't know you had. I hope that answered your question.
It does. Thank you. That's what I wanted to hear.
So Jason, with grain in particular, with the way that farm programs work at the federal level, particularly with peanuts, so when we deliver peanuts, just about all peanuts go into the loan program.
Correct.
And then the sheller will buy those out and then pay us the difference in whatever the contract might be. If you have a grain dealer that does go insolvent, that the grower has product in a loan program, where does USDA, where do they come into the picture? Because they're holding the producer's been paid on the loan, they're holding the commodity as the collateral, but then you have the dealer also in the picture.
So in the state of Georgia, very, very, very few. I know where the route that you're going with this, but I want to back it up. You say grain dealer, and terminology in Georgia is very important. A grain dealer cannot receipt any grain in the state of Georgia because they have zero oversight outside of a self-audit form once a year. A grain warehouse can store and receipt cotton. That receipt normally just goes to your local bank. They do have the ability. We have never had a CCC since I've been here, a CCC loan on grain through the state. Now there are other federal grain warehouses that we can talk more on later on.
Okay.
That we can look to see how much grain has been receipted in Georgia through the CCC. But right now, we don't do any in the state of Georgia. But a grain dealer cannot receipt grain. That is the two things. You have two ways to go: a grain dealer or a grain warehouse. A dealer can only buy and write checks to Georgia producers. A grain warehouse can store. Other states use the word store differently than we do. Okay, they use the word store as delayed pricing or price later contracting. That is considered storage in other states. Storage in Georgia means that you have cows at your house and you're going to take grain to that grain warehouse and you're going to come back and get it to grind feed for your cattle. You're going to come back and pick that grain up. That's storage, and we track that completely separate. I don't even think anybody in the state of Georgia does it anymore. Whenever I first started, it was really common that Farmer Smith down the road doesn't have a bin, but he grew some corn and he wants to be able to use it to feed his cows. So we would track that on a separate sheet, and know that Farmer Smith brought in 10,000 bushels. On February the 3rd, he picked up 500 bushels. So now he has 9,500 bushels storage in there. Now, the word storage can get really sticky, and I've had that conversation with other states, the way that they operate it versus how we operate it. But you can store and receipt grain in Georgia as a grain warehouse, but not as a grain dealer. And I know that I kind of took it a different place than what you were asking, but I wanted to make sure that we had the definition of those words correct, because when you go to grain dealer to grain warehouse, it's a whole different set of rules and laws.
Thank you for that clarification. Any other questions from members of the committee? Commissioner, any other?
Mr. Chairman, I don't really have anything to add other than I just appreciate y'all taking the time to look into this. As I said yesterday, and I think Representative Leverett has ably kind of laid out, this is a very complicated issue. And as my friends in the ag world know, that in agriculture, it can get really complicated really fast. And that's what makes agriculture policy so difficult sometimes, both on the state level and on the federal level, is you really need individuals that have a breadth of understanding of how those policy issues work. And I appreciate the ones that don't come from necessarily that background or that world taking an opportunity to really dive off into this. But I know we have a number of members of the General Assembly. Many of you are on this committee, whether your background's in peanuts or cotton or produce, that have a phenomenal understanding of the way those policy issues work. And, you know, at the end of the day, our goal at the department is to protect our farmers and our producers and to ensure that they're taken care of. They're the lifeline of our number one industry, which in turn is the lifeline of our state as a whole. And that's our goal. And that's the whole purpose of this conversation, because we believe we could do a better job as a state protecting our farmers and producers, and in turn protecting our number one industry. And I just want to say thank you for taking an opportunity to really dive off into this and look into this. And I definitely look forward to more conversation as we move forward, and look forward to ways that we can help ag and help our producers in this state continue to be successful. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think what we'll do is you should have in your email the model legislation from Wisconsin that Jason had talked about. Anna, you sent that out to everybody. I think what we'll do is give you a chance to look through that as members of the committee, and then maybe do a Zoom call mid-December, early December, if that's appropriate with everybody, so we can, have one final opportunity to make some recommendations and finalize the report, which was due December 31st. Is that correct? Does that sound like a plan because I think the more we talk about it, we realize just how complicated this issue is, and heeding the warnings of Mr. Wamba here, we don't want to make it more difficult and mess it up worse than it already is for certain. So I think we'll do that, and then circle up with a Zoom call meeting to make some final recommendations once we've had a chance to really take a dive into this and have some conversations among ourselves and with the department, or with Ledge Council as to what some of it does, and then move from there. Is that suitable with everyone? All right. Well, thank you for your time the last 2 days, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your approach to this, and Commissioner, those comments, and staff. I think what we really need to do is make sure we have good value to the producers, and I think that's the path we're on, and I really appreciate that. And I know it is complicated, and but at the end of the day, whatever program we craft or changes we make is good value to producers and our ag economy, all entities, and doesn't just lift more regulation, more costs, more things, but good value is what I'm looking for in it. And so thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this committee and the Commissioner, what you're doing, and your great staff doing a great job. I'm very impressed. Yeah.
It would take him even though he's part-time.
And like I said, I almost felt guilty leaving because I'd started so much, and in this day and time, it's hard to have a conscience because I didn't want to walk away starting all of this, and that's why I told Chad and the commissioner both. I was like, I'm here until you've got everything fixed. So I mean, I plan on being here a long time on a part-time consulting basis, and I've told the commissioner, I've told Chad, and I've told everybody else, and I'll tell you, I'm nothing but a phone call away. Whether it's 2 a.m. or 2 p.m., just give me a call. I would rather answer questions 100 times on 100 phone calls than you have questions that never get answered, and then you have to sit there and try to write them down, and then remember the next time we meet, just call me. I'm always available days, nights, and weekends. I work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
That's great.
Well, we appreciate your willingness to do that, and with the institutional knowledge that you have on the issue is very valuable to us as committee members and members of the General Assembly. So thank you for that. If nothing else, I hope everyone has a great Thanksgiving, gathering with your family and the time of year that we're entering in the holiday season. So happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Merry Christmas. We will gather on a Zoom call before then, but thank you for your time and your thoughts, conversations. With that, do I hear a motion to adjourn? Second? We are adjourned. Thank you.